Welcome to today's event, everyone. As all of us know, President Biden and President Yoon recently issued what is known as the Washington Declaration. And the declaration is intended to deal with the reoccurring problem of bolstering extended deterrence on the Korean Peninsula. And I think, as many of us know, it's not a new problem. The Obama administration had talks beginning in 2010 through 2016 to discuss that issue with South Korea. And nor is it a problem that is likely to go away. So we thought we'd convene an expert panel today. Everyone on the panel has direct experience dealing with this issue. And it's to look at the past, present, and future of extended deterrence in Korea and in Northeast Asia writ large. We have four speakers. I'm not going to launch into a long introduction for each one. We have Elaine Bunn, who's a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy in the Obama administration. Paul Bernstein is a former Distinguished Fellow at the National Defense University. Jenny Town, of course, is the director of the 38 North program and a senior fellow at the Henry L. Stimson Center. And General Curtis Scaparrotti has the distinction of being both the former U.S. commander of troops in Korea as well as the commander of NATO, the NATO alliance. Today, what we'll do is each speaker will talk for 10 minutes. And then I'd like to get to the audience as quickly as possible and try to answer questions. So as the speakers are talking, please send in questions and we'll try to field as many as we can. So let's start with Elaine.
Thanks, Joel. There are a lot of commitments in the Washington Declaration from the Yoon-Biden summit. How do they differ from what we've done with the South Koreans in the past on nuclear deterrence and broader deterrence issues? As Joel said, formal consultations with South Korea on nuclear deterrence began in 2010. It was long past due when it started, with something called the Extended Deterrence Policy Committee. The group was renamed, you probably know it by the Deterrence Strategy Committee, changed in 2015 when it merged with the Counter Missile Capabilities Group and expanded its scope beyond extended deterrence to include both ROC and U.S. commitments to alliance deterrence. That is, U.S. and ROC conventional forces as well as U.S. nuclear forces. So I'll just call it the Deterrence Strategy Committee. I was deeply involved in the DSC when I was Deputy Assistant Secretary, co-chaired the group for the U.S. From early 2013 to the end of 2016, though the DSC did continue to meet into the Trump and the Biden administrations as well. Since 2010, there have been dozens of multi-day, in-depth bilateral discussions on deterrence, alternating between the U.S. and South Korea for the meetings. They typically include assessments of evolving North Korean threats, including nuclear threats, updates by each country on policy, strategy, forces. It has included tabletop exercises and visits to nuclear bases or other forces. I mean, we've seen ICBM launches, we've gone on submarines, SSBNs, and we climbed into bombers, visited nuclear labs, as well as Strategic Command. The DSC's work led to the Tailored Deterrence Strategy document, which was agreed by defense ministers in 2013. And it also led to the 4D strategy, that is detect, disrupt, defend, and destroy. In 2016, the US and South Korea added another group, the higher level State and Defense Extended Deterrence Consultative and Strategy Committee, which met again, it met in 2016, 2019, 2022. I'd like to pull back the curtain a little bit on the kinds of things that were done in those groups and compare that with the Washington Declaration. Note that I can only compare the words in the Declaration. As I understand, a lot of the details on implementation are still being worked out. The declaration says the U.S., quote, commits to make every effort to consult with ROC on any possible nuclear weapons employment on the Korean Peninsula. This issue was one that was constantly discussed in past dialogues, but without the kind of resolution you see in the Washington Declaration. You know that the use of U.S. nuclear weapons is a decision that only the U.S. president is authorized to make. So the commitment at the presidential level to make every effort to consult is very significant. The president's last month also announced the establishment of a new nuclear consultative group, the NSG, to strengthen extended deterrence, discuss nuclear and strategic planning, and manage DPRK nuclear threats. Now, that description sounds a lot like what we did in the Deterrence Strategy Committee, but certainly we think it will be at a higher level. It sounds similar in title to NATO's ministerial level nuclear planning group, a group that was actually misnamed because it did policy, not planning in the sense of military planning. It's unclear yet at what level the NCG will be, this nuclear consultative group for U.S. and ROC, or how it will differ from these existing groups, the Deterrence Strategy Committee or the EDSCG. The Washington Declaration refers to these other bodies, certainly the EDSCG, and says it's going to strengthen the standing bodies for consultation on extended deterrence. So it's not clear whether it will be above these groups, it will replace one of the groups. It's not quite clear yet, but that is a significant step, I think, that it specifically calls out a nuclear consultative group. The Washington Declaration also says that the U.S. will further enhance the regular visibility of strategic assets to the Korean Peninsula, as evidenced by the upcoming visit of a U.S. nuclear ballistic missile submarine to the ROK, and will deepen and expand coordination between our militaries. So in the past, the U.S. has at times made U.S. offshore nuclear weapons more visible in South Korea's neighborhood. In November 2016, for the first time in a couple of decades, a U.S. SSBN pulled into a port in Guam. The ROC Joint Chiefs of Staff chair went aboard with General Vince Brooks, who was then the CFC commander, and toured the subs, talked with the crew, and then they briefed the press. That was a reminder to allies in Asia that nuclear weapons are always in their neighborhood, even if they don't normally see them. They're not normally visible. And my understanding is that happened again in, I believe it was 2019. We've also made them visible via nuclear capable bombers. As you know, B-2s and B-52s have regularly flown to the region to signal U.S. commitments to allies, to South Korea particularly, after North Korean nuclear tests or provocations. And some of those flights have included South Korean conventional aircraft escorts to U.S. strategic bombers. So visits to strategic assets to the region are not new, but it's been a long, long time since an SSBN pulled into a South Korean port. So I think that's significant. I am concerned that that ROK may expect more regular deployments after the promised SSBN visits than the U.S. can carry out, but we'll see. Other options for that kind of visibility that the U.S. still hasn't demonstrated, something that was in 3 nuclear posture reviews, the last 3, that said that we can globally deploy dual capable aircraft, which we certainly can, but we have not exercised. The Washington Declaration says that the alliance has established, quote, a new bilateral interagency tabletop simulation to strengthen the joint approach to planning for nuclear contingencies. It also refers to tabletop exercises separately with U.S. Strategic Command. So what's happened in the past? There have been dozens of tabletop exercises in the Deterrence Strategy Committee over the past 13 years. I know in the 4 years that I was there, they've explored a variety of scenarios, and that lets them talk about what the key considerations would be for both countries' leaders and their advisors in dealing with those kinds of scenarios. It really allows South Korean and US, both civilian and military officials who were part of these delegations, to think through, a number of different feasible scenarios and options involving nuclear crises, to understand if there are differing perspectives and priorities, and to sort those out among allies in peacetime rather than in the midst of a crisis. So it is, my question is how the Washington Declaration tabletops differ from the Deterrence Strategy Committee tabletops of the past 13 years. I believe it will be upping the level of participants, because I'm not sure about how the content might change, because past tabletops have gone all the way to potential North Korean nuclear use. They just don't predict what a U.S. president's decision might be, and I'm concerned that the ROC participants may think that these new exercises will do that. My observation is that anyone who says they know what a U.S. president would decide in any particular situation is an amateur. So I think they are very important for the reasons I stated, not just what would the U.S. president do, which is not the purpose of these exercises. The Washington Declaration commits to closely connecting the capabilities and planning activities of the new ROC Strategic Command and the U.S. ROC Combined Forces Command. And that's where it also says that there will be tabletop exercises with Strategic Command. So the link, though, the primary link is between ROC Strategic Command, including South Korea's conventional strike capability, and CFC, notably not U.S. Strategic Command. So I guess for me, as I look at the Washington Declaration and think about what we have done in the past, my observations are that consultations are not new, but the Washington Declaration raises the level and further institutionalizes those consultations with the Nuclear Consultative Group. Tabletop exercises are not new, but the Declaration seems to increase the level. Visits of strategic assets are not new, but this ups the level with an SSB and visit to South Korea. And planning together is not new, but the Washington Declaration is an evolution toward greater integration of planning and assets for deterrence, both those of the US and those of South Korea. So with that, I look forward to hearing what other people have to say.
Thank you. Thank you, Elaine. Paul?
Thanks, Joe. And thanks for inviting me to join this conversation. And it's a pleasure to be on this panel with Elaine, Jenny, and General Scaparrotti. What Joel asked me to do was to take a look at some of the commentary reacting to the Washington Declaration, including the critiques that have been offered up. There's been a lot of commentary from, I think, the usual quarters. I think the arguments fall along familiar and fairly predictable lines. So I don't think there are too many surprises. Though there is a wide range of views out there. Some folks are very happy, some are disappointed. Many have mixed feelings with views that fall somewhere in the middle. I would say at the outset that I think it's a useful drill to map out the commentary to get a feel for how the Washington Declaration does or does not conform to the views and the beliefs held in various parts of our regional and functional communities, by which I mean the Korea watchers on the one hand and the nuclear crowd on the other. But going through that exercise is also a reminder, if we needed one, that degree to instant analysis of complex issues like this, and in this case, the policy adaptations whose success or failure is yet to be determined, and will be decided more by stakeholders than by analysts, and that are subject as they move away from square one to decisions and choices that may not be entirely predictable, which at least to me suggests we should approach our assessment of the Declaration with a degree of humility. And not in some deterministic way. So with that off my chest, let me try to capture what I think are four main threads of commentary. As I know, observers see the Declaration as an unambiguous. Some of this is viewed through the lens of U.S. nonproliferation policy, where Seoul's affirmation of its NPT commitments is seen as an important win for Washington that avoids a potential crisis in the NPT regime. Some of this is viewed through the lens of alliance management and is focused on giving credit to the Biden administration for taking seriously the concerns of an important ally, taking concrete steps to address those concerns. and recognizing the need at this particular moment for a tighter embrace of that ally. And some of this is viewed more directly and specifically through the lens of assurance and the extended nuclear deterrence relationship. And the assessment here is that the Washington Declaration is a major step forward in the alliance's effort to deter, prepare for, and if necessary, respond to the North Korean nuclear threat, precisely because it recognizes and makes more salient the nuclear dimension of the bilateral relationships. Indeed, it should be seen as marking a transition from sort of a client-type relationship wherein the U.S. is largely a provider of nuclear security commitments to one that over time should be characterized by a more integrated approach, where South Korea has a greater and more informed voice, and where its conventional force capabilities can become a more important part of the deterrence equation. So this reading of the Washington Declaration, I think it's fair to say, is pretty forward-leaning, optimistic, and even expansive in terms of assessing the direction that it sets and what the future payoff could be. I would say this is not the typical or majority view. More common is the view that this is a positive step forward, but doesn't necessarily go far enough, and therefore represents some lost opportunities. A positive step forward because clearly something needed to be done to strengthen assurance and South Korea's confidence in the U.S. commitment. The pledges made by the U.S. with respect to information sharing, crisis communication and coordination, enhanced dialogue on nuclear contingencies, all that's good and necessary. And the fact that they've been made at the head of state level is important, but this is not really sufficient given the nature of the problem and the trend line. More could or should have been addressed. Some of the commentary argues, for instance, that missile defense is conspicuously absent from the discussion of assurance, especially given that an important part of what worries South Korea is the course of North Korea's maturing long-range missile capability to decouple the alliance. It shouldn't be about the ways in which our national missile defense capability sort of reinforces our willingness to take risks on behalf of our allies. That's sort of an argument that's being made. Other commentary argues that what's missing from the assurance conversation is some focus on U.S. nuclear forces, in particular capabilities that many consider to be sort of more tailored to the regional deterrence and assurance mission, and therefore would strengthen the credibility of U.S. nuclear security commitments. So no surprise, we see some analysis of the Washington Declaration commenting on things like the nuclear armed sea-launched cruise missiles. Gee, and wouldn't it help the cause if we could point to that capability as part of the mix of measures we're taking to enhance assurance and extended deterrence? We all know that particular weapon system was canceled by the 2022 Nuclear Posture Review. But, whether it's missile defense or regional nuclear systems, there's a line of argument out there that I think is saying that in the discussion of assurance, capabilities count. And in what is largely a conversation about the software of extended deterrence, which is what the Washington Declaration addresses for the most part. What about the hardware? What about the hardware beyond the port calls and the other things we will do to show the nuclear flag in the region? A different line of commentary observes that, despite the goodness of the declaration, there's really nothing in it that addresses the North Korean threat itself. Some commentators ask, why is there nothing to strengthen or reinforce sanctions? Coming from a different direction, ask, why is there nothing new to advance a diplomatic line of effort that would seek to engage on some form of risk reduction, beyond the boilerplate about our continued commitment to denuclearization? For some observers, this, in particular, coupled with the words spoken by President Yoon about the importance of superior forces, not the good faith of other governments, the importance of superior forces to peace and security, is seen as effectively ending any prospect of threat reduction and signaling our abandonment of this line of effort. And the last thing I'll observe about those commentators who see the Washington Declaration as a mixed bag is that there is some concern about how enduring these new arrangements may be, right? The commitments and the architecture are credible, convincing, but what kind of staying power will they have? And this concern takes a number of forms. Will they keep pace with a dynamic threat, assuming North Korea continues to advance its nuclear and missile forces and continues to engage in provocative behavior? Will they remain active and effective in the face of the many demands on U.S. strategic attention and bandwidth? And will they survive the results of the 2024 election if the next president is not Joe Biden? There is some talk in the commentary about how the Washington Declaration and the broader summit results can be seen as a way to more deeply institutionalize the alliance. That's a phrase Elaine used, and I would agree with that. More deeply institutionalize the alliance and bind the U.S. and South Korea in ways that may be difficult to undo by a different kind of leadership. So I think there's a sense of fragility about this initiative, and to some degree, a hedging quality about it. A third thread in the commentary is sort of less inclined to see this as a positive step forward. Rather, it's viewed as basically a form of damage control, a Band-Aid, if you will, to stop the bleeding in the extended deterrence relationship. So, an effort to maintain the status quo with few, if any, substantive changes going forward in how we actually do business with South Korea on the nuclear question. This is the often heard old wine, new bottles argument that tends to minimize what others may see as meaningful innovations, pointing out that, most of what is discussed in terms of nuclear consultation is already covered in the work of existing bilateral consultation. Some commentators take this one step further and more or less predict that sooner rather than later, that Band-Aid's going to fall off, and we're going to be compelled to consider farther reaching steps that are likely to be outside our comfort zone. The fourth and the final broad thread of commentary is something I would characterize as sort of too much, not enough, right? Too much, not enough. What does that mean? This is a reference, I think, to two arguments about the appropriate role of nuclear deterrence in addressing assurance challenges with South Korea. The too much argument basically says that doubling down on nuclear deterrence is a losing bet that will add to insecurity. Elevating the nuclear dimension is considered bad policy for several reasons. First, it suggests a lack of confidence in conventional deterrence and distracts from the work we're doing in that domain. That really should be the principal focus of our efforts to shore up deterrence. Second, elevating the nuclear dimension encourages allies to engage in a form of bargaining that seeks to extract concessions from the United States by playing on our fears of proliferation. And this really is a form of sort of tail wagging the dog and even a form of moral hazard that we should not incentivize. Third, elevating the nuclear dimension cuts against the president's stated desire to reduce reliance on nuclear weapons. This was an important theme in the 2022 Nuclear Posture Review, even if the steps taken by the NPR to concretely reduce reliance are pretty modest. Fourth, elevating the nuclear dimension today will not put out the pro-nuclear fire in South Korea, at least among the zealots who see every endorsement of nuclear deterrence as strengthening the case for an independent nuclear force. And finally, elevating the nuclear dimension will merely set the stage for the next nuclear crisis, because the need for assurance never goes away, and because fundamentally there's no way to eliminate doubts about the United States' willingness to accept existential risks for an ally. This is the so-called bottomless bucket argument. So the bottom line in this commentary is that while there's good stuff in the Washington Declaration, it should be used not to double down on nuclear deterrence, but rather to focus more sharply on conventional deterrence. So that's sort of the too much argument, too much nuclear. The not enough argument says that instead of stepping back from the nuclear dimension, we need to go further. We need to go beyond symbolic or incremental process-oriented steps that are not really the right answer to the nuclear deterrence problem. We need to be more receptive to the idea of returning nuclear weapons to South Korea or some form of nuclear sharing that draws from the NATO experience. These approaches are not viewed as problem or risk-free, but they are seen as likely to do more to address the deterrence problem and are sort of the right middle ground between what's in the Washington Declaration and South Korea's pursuit of its own nuclear weapons, which is an idea that is not going to go away. So, too much nuclear, not enough nuclear, two arguments we're seeing for why the Washington Declaration doesn't get it quite right. Okay, so I suspect my 10 minutes are about up. As I said at the outset, 4 main lines of commentary across a pretty broad range of opinion. I'm going to stop there, Joel, and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Paul. Jenny?
Thanks, Joel, and it's great to be on a panel with Paul, Elaine, and General Scaparrotti. I was just in Seoul last week, and so Joel's asked me to talk a little bit more about this, how South Koreans are perceiving this, and what some of the concerns are about what happened. And I want to just take a step back real quickly and just mention that, last year we did publish a report that was looking at extended deterrence and offered various ways to try and adapt our deterrence posture and enhance the assurance effect based on a 1 year long bilateral dialogue between US and ROC experts. And while questioning of US extended deterrence, as others have mentioned, both the capabilities and the commitment are not new themes. These anxieties in the region really have been greatly impacted by two key developments over the past few years. The first is, really Russia's invasion of Ukraine was really a turning point in South Korean psyche of a nuclear weapon state attacking a non-nuclear weapon state and threatening to use nuclear weapons. And this has really brought about a greater sense of vulnerability, especially to potential North Korean nuclear attack as North Korea's WMD capabilities grow. And potentially Chinese attack in the future if the alliance were to ever dissolve. So if they ever find themselves alone, what do they have that can compete with these nuclear powers? Which brings me to sort of the second major trigger that's really brought about this nuclear argument in South Korea, and that is actually US domestic politics. And here's where we saw the trauma of the Trump years, his antagonism towards alliances in general, and South Korea especially, including repeated threats of withdrawing US troops from the peninsula. Like, this trauma is still fresh. And given the state of US domestic politics these days, the political polarization and the potential for either Trump or someone like-minded to get reelected in the future, the reassurance black hole, as Paul referred to, is deepening, even as cooperation also expands. So it's understandable in many ways and will remain a reality for the foreseeable future. Some of the recommendations that we had in the report are actually somewhat reflected in the Washington Declaration, including the idea of exercises to include a wider range of scenarios, especially including nuclear use, beginning conventional support for nuclear operations to better prepare for the potential of fighting after nuclear use, and setting up some kind of bilateral, even trilateral consultative mechanism to enhance South Korean understanding of US nuclear planning capabilities and decision-making. And, together these are positive developments, as both Elaine and Paul have mentioned so far, that improve communication about how potential nuclear use could come about, what elements are factored into such a decision, what role South Korea would play in supporting such operations, etc. But I think that the way that the Washington Declaration was rolled out really diminished the value of all of these moves in and of themselves, as it really placed it in the context of preventing South Korea from going nuclear versus improving our overall alliance cooperation and communication on extended deterrence in practice. And I think there's a couple of key reasons why I say this. And the first one is announcing the nuclear consultative group without having the details yet of what this actually looks like in practice, I think was premature, because it creates greater confusion about what this is going to look like, how it is different, as Elaine talked about, how it's different than the bodies that already exist. And I think it creates greater confusion than it does confidence that this will actually make a difference in our relations. How can it be reassuring if the answers to those questions about what it will look like, who's going to be involved, what it will cover, when all of these things are still unknown and yet to be determined? And I think there's a lot of kind of ideas on the US side of what it will look like, but that's still very nebulous on the South Korean side. And it's really unclear what all this will really accomplish then. And so in Korean policy circles, there's already questions about what more the US can provide, even though we don't fully understand yet what all the Washington Declaration actually provides and what all the nuclear consultative group will provide. And certainly it will have, and as Paul was talking about, it will have little impact as well on North Korea's actual testing regime and willingness to engage in these small-scale provocations, which is ultimately one of the things that South Koreans are eager are looking to deter. Secondly, and more importantly, I think framing it even implicitly as it was done, at least in the press conference around its announcement, as a bargain to keep South Korea from going nuclear means that it's now being evaluated against that rubric. And so instead of like, is this a good step forward in our alliance cooperation? Yes. But is it enough to keep South Korea from going nuclear? That's a bigger question. And how is it a better solution than Seoul having its own nuclear button? So in Seoul might have more insight now and might be better informed in a nuclear decision-making process. But it is still dependent on the US making that decision. And it still doesn't create the nuclear parity between the two Koreas, which many South Koreans actually desire and are more openly calling for these days. And I think that leaves us with a couple broader issues. And one is how to convey to the public an actual reassuring effect. As Elaine talked about in terms of these different bodies that have existed, and while Elaine was part of a lot of these consultations, very few people are, and very few people actually understand the technical jargon and the technical details of what this actually does. And so when speaking to the public, right now there's still a lot of discussion about what the nuclear consultative group is on a very technical level, which isn't very reassuring. It's also necessary to convey to the public. The reality is what the public needs to know is that there's a new level of cooperation. And this needs to be really driven by South Korean leaders, not the US, to control the narrative that demonstrates a new level of confidence in our alliance capabilities and commitment, not all the gory details that most people really aren't going to understand. And so until we get to that level where South Korean leaders are really promoting that sentiment, we're still always going to be stuck in this, what more can US do? What I also heard a lot of in Seoul last week was, as Paul talked about a little bit, was growing frustration about how we're so focused on deterrence, but none of these moves work to lessen tensions on the peninsula or work to diminish the actual threat from North Korea. And there's still a pretty steady call for finding ways to re-engage in diplomacy with North Koreans while also working to bolster deterrence. And that this messaging was really missing, not only from the Washington Declaration, but from the summit itself and the summit readout itself. I do think we need to be a little bit careful, or in South Korea, I think they need to understand there is a sort of a counterproductive narrative being built here as well. This kind of constant harping for nuclear weapons in South Korea can also be undermining of US over time, especially with the American public. Right? While it's understandable now, the constant insistence could also wear on the American public and American psyche. If that's really what Seoul wants to do, then why do they need us? And I think, especially again, if there is political transitions, I think this is going to be a more sensitive subject that does need some, real careful messaging to the public in the future as we go forward. And I think my final point is really, and Paul also alluded to this, is this idea that now that we've tiptoed into the realm of almost nuclear coercion by an ally, I think this is also something that will be, in reality, something we'll need to deal with for the foreseeable future. And so since this was framed as South Korea got the Washington Declaration by pledging to, reaffirming the nuclear nonproliferation commitment and preventing them from going nuclear, I think there's already talk in Seoul about how this might also be useful in, say, future 123 agreement negotiations, or even getting the long-desired nuclear submarines that South Korea has always, and posing this as like, if we get this, we don't have to go nuclear. So I think now that that door has been opened, I think it'll be very difficult to lock up again. And I'll leave it there. Thanks, Joel.
Thanks, Jenny. Scap?
All right, got it. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, super. Thank you. Well, listen, it's great to be here today, and particularly with this panel. I appreciate it very much, and I'm honored to be with you. after listening to the comments here thus far, though, it kind of reminds me of the NATO statement that, everything's been said, but not by everybody. So I guess I'll pitch in at this point. My task is the task you asked me to take on is provide a comparison of the nuclear strategic coordination in both NATO and the ROC-US alliance, and then how does Washington Declaration bolster strategic deterrence, as well as the implications for U.S. forces Korea. So I'll try and cover those quickly. I'll cover them generally and also with my experience, which is a little bit dated. I try to stay current, but remember I left command in 2016. First, I'd like to make clear that a comparison of the ROC and U.S. alliance and the ROC-U.S. alliance with the NATO alliance nuclear strategic deterrence can be somewhat misleading because really each alliance provides a framework that's quite unique. It must be, since they each operate in different security environments, focus on different targets or adversaries, and bring different allied resources to bear. But there is value in considering processes in one that may be adapted for greater effect in another. In fact, I took some lessons learned from the ROC-US alliance and applied them in, EUCOM and NATO as well as I went from one theater to the next. The ROC-US alliance has existed for 70 years and was forged in blood during the Korean War and further stiffened in very challenging and sometimes combative mid-years of the alliance. This shared hardship defines the alliance in many ways and sets it a bit different from NATO, I think. It has a mature and agile crisis management process and an integrated ROC-US command structure. The Combined Forces Command, which is the alliance Combined Forces Command commander reports to both the U.S. and ROC ministers of defense and both the heads of state. Guidance flows from this combined structure. Decisions and options for planning and execution work within this combined chain for mutual decision. In other words, it's a pretty clear process that the commander works under and deals with defense and deterrence every day. The issues of strategic deterrence, such as planned strategic bomber exercise near the peninsula, which Elaine pointed out we did regularly, were addressed within this combined framework. Nuclear issues were limited to an extremely small body of military and defense leaders. The U.S. made sure that each ROC chief of defense, and that's their equivalent to the chairman, and the CFC deputy commander, which was the Republic of Korea 4-star that was the deputy to the alliance commander, made a visit to the DC and to Stratcom to get briefed on strategic capabilities and processes. We tried to make sure they stayed current. Also, the ROC had a liaison, an officer at Stratcom headquarters in the US to act as a linkage. Basically, those in need to know were a very tight shot group. During my tenure, the sensitive planning was strictly US and done off the peninsula. We then shared selected information with the ROC leadership as we needed to. On the ministerial side, the alliance worked readiness, modernization, strategic deterrence issues, and a routinely scheduled set of bilateral meetings at the deputy ministerial level. And these meetings are the ones that produced alliance combined policy and planning. Elaine, I think, described those quite well and actually reminded me of some things that I had forgotten about as you talked. But I felt they were rather robust at the time. So overall, the education, and I think that's an important part of this, the collaboration and training for nuclear deterrence was confined to a smaller group of senior leaders. But given the agility of the management process, the close daily relationships of the leaders and staff, we could be responsive and address the ROC assurance issues and provide the conventional strategic deterrence required at the time. Now let me turn to NATO. NATO is a different beast. 29 nations when I was the SAC-EUR, now 31. NATO also approaching its 75th birthday, is also mature and has an established planning and decision framework as well. That, as you know, requires unanimous consent for any of the decisions. The size of the alliance makes the processes less agile on a routine basis, and the processes are therefore more complex. Also, NATO is confronted with the deterrence and defense of a near-peer nuclear adversary. Specifically, NATO is declared nuclear alliance, and with tactical nuclear assets deployed in the transatlantic AOR. As a result, NATO has established policy, standards, and processes for the security, safety, and readiness of the nuclear force. In the military organization, below command responsibilities, below the commander himself, management was provided by a small but expert group of planners and operators from the nuclear state allies, UK and the US, and allied nations that provided conventional support. This is on the military side of this now. Again, a small group of experts with a need to know integrated into the alliance, and they work there every day. This was their day job, 365 days a year. The nuclear planning group was a ministerial level planning group of alliance nations except France. The MPG shaped and provided policy guidance that drove the North Atlantic Council level exercises and discussions, which took place several times a year. Usually, at least when I left, every defense ministerial, we had some form of nuclear strategic deterrence discussion driven basically by the MPG's preparation. And these NAC discussions were important in education of the ministers themselves and the country's understanding of capabilities, and also played a key role, I think, in assurance and deterrence, as well as they were usually communicated publicly. In NATO, we also held exercises and training of the nuclear deterrent at various levels: tabletop, unit and base exercises, and conventional strategic operations annually to train to standard, but also to demonstrate capability and will. In NATO, this greater integration was driven by the complexity of the alliance, allied reassurance, and the deterrence of a very different adversary, Russia. Again, I'll just state again, NATO and the ROK-US alliance were unique and structured to address deterrence in their area. As I watch the North Korean development of its nuclear capabilities in numbers, range, and diversity of systems, it's clear that the deterrence and defense of the ROK-US alliance has to adapt as well. We've all been aware of the increasing ROK public desire for their own nuclear systems. I've heard it every time that I've gone to Korea recently, just as Jenny pointed out. And I think also a loss of assurance of our extended deterrence, or at least assurance we're going to be there when we need them. Now, I believe the Washington Declaration, despite the criticisms that we've heard and discussed and I've read about, it outlines an effective way ahead for strengthening the ROK-US alliance, reassuring the ROK populace, and deterring an evolving North Korean threat. In short, the presidents in the Washington Declaration committed to drive greater integration of strategic deterrence planning, training, consultation, and execution. And if you were to ask me, I think that's the key. It was very closely held in the military range, below the ministerial level. And even in the ministerial groups, they were pretty tight groups. And talking to my friends in the Republic of Korea, they just believe they need more insight into our capabilities and into the options in planning. Now, I'd remind you that these processes or commitments that I'm talking about are a process and not an end state. Therefore, they won't be the perfect response. The ROK-US alliance will have to adapt as it moves along, and this will take time to implement. The education and security base that's got to be established for greater integration and sharing of information needs to be expanded first, in my opinion. What are the implications for the U.S. forces, Korea? Well, General LeCamera and his team will need to organize for these new processes and also work with his ROK counterparts to design the organization of process changes in the alliance in order to increase integration of strategic deterrence. The planning and execution of exercises and training, they're pretty robust now in the alliance, and this will be leveraged to better integrate conventional and strategic assets. As Elaine said, this is not something we haven't been doing, something we've been doing now over all the years. And that's a relatively, I think, easy task. The existing military consultative meetings are called MCMs, where the ROK chairman and the U.S. chairman review process on key tasks and make alliance military decisions. Will likely be the venue to drive these changes at the military level. And then at the ministerial level, the meeting called an SCM, the senior consultative meetings, where the defense ministers meet, will likely drive the strategic deterrence policy decisions for the alliance. So in closing, just a couple of things I'd reiterate. In making a comparison, you've got to recognize that there's some things that can be used, but they're pretty unique to each alliance. Secondly, when talking about nuclear deterrence, most think immediately of nuclear assets and employment. But nuclear deterrence rests on a foundation of conventional readiness and requires substantial conventional support. In other words, deterrence is a full spectrum affair. Now, I was encouraged to see that was recognized in the declaration itself, as well as the note that the ROC Strategic Command capabilities will be connected with Combined Forces Command. I think that's an important step in that way. Finally, assurance and deterrence are fundamentally about cognitive recognition by our allies and our adversary as well. For our allies, driving a belief that we are ready, capable, and willing to come to the ROC's aid, and a recognition in our adversary's mind that based on our capability and will, any benefit of aggression will be outweighed by the costs imposed, therefore deterring them. So those are a few of my thoughts, and I'll wrap it up there, and I look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Cap. Before we turn to the audience for questions, and please do send in more questions. I only have one. So, I want to go to a very basic point here. I think everything our speakers have outlined about what's being done is interesting and detailed, but also it's confined to a small group of people in the United States and South Korea who are interested in these issues. And I say that because to me, what's driving this problem are two things that are not confined to that small group. It's first, the visible growing threats that everyone can see, particularly people on the Korean Peninsula, from North Korea mainly, but also China. And then secondly, the political and public pressures in South Korea that I think are a big factor in driving forward. And so for me, I feel like we're on a slippery slope, that the Washington Declaration may be a good step. It may deal with the problem right now, but we may be having a different conversation a year from now that will require more steps. So I want to throw that out there. Are we on a slippery slope without dealing with these two major issues, the political pressures and the growing threat? And how do we deal with those? I think North Korea, we can discuss that, but is it possible to deal with the political pressures in South Korea to keep moving down this road that may lead to some sort of nuclear capability? I'm gonna ask Elaine first. I'm gonna turn to Elaine because Elaine and I have had conversations about her experience in the nuclear dialogue, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot, Elaine, but your
Well,
perspective.
no, I just think that the whole nature of extended nuclear deterrence, so that we have nuclear weapons for the defense of our allies, is one of those issues that just needs to be constantly. It's a constant. There is no one and done. We're there. You're assured. The adversary is deterred. It is a constantly evolving situation, and I think there will be further evolutions. We've seen evolutions so far in how we discuss together, plan together, open the kimono. We used to say, don't you worry your pretty little heads, we'll just take care of it. That is not the case anymore. And we've seen that evolution. We will continue to see that evolution. So we shouldn't think that this is the end. I don't know what the next steps will need to be. And on the how do you assure publics, some things have to be visible, and I think what Jenny said about South Korean leaders showing more confidence in the deterrence relationship, about what they can do, what we can do, what we do together, is part of that as well.
Joel, if I could reinforce that, that's what I meant by this is a process, not an end state. Deterrence is daily. And as Elaine just said, we're going to continue to adapt this as the threat evolves. The second thing I'd like to make is our deterrence is aimed at one thing: aggression. So the idea that we're going to stop their provocations, et cetera, through nuclear deterrence, that's not at all the case. And often I hear those statements, and I think there needs to be a clear understanding of what that nuclear deterrent is for. It's for aggression. And if we want to affect the provocations, then that's within the conventional realm, and we need to take more risk. We need to be what others might call more provocative, because I think we could arrest that if we chose to do so.
Any
Joel,
other
Joe,
comments?
I would. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say. Should I
Jenny,
go?
you'll go after Paul.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I would agree. I mean, this is an evolutionary development. It's not transformational in any way, in my view. It's a natural evolution of the process that began, 10, 12 years ago that Elaine described to us. I think it's a prudent response to the changes we're seeing in the security and political landscape. But, I think we should have a realistic take on this and not overstate, what's in the document itself or what the long-term payoff is likely to be. We just don't know. And I think you're right, Joel. We may find ourselves after some period of time, I don't know if it's a year or something longer than that, where we have to revisit this perhaps and think about, more far-reaching actions. A lot's going to depend on how the threat evolves, but not just the threat. I mean, how the regional security environment more broadly evolves, and how the political situation evolves in a number of different capitals. We can't perfectly control, how all those things work out. I would agree. I'm not an expert on South Korea or its politics, but it seems to me very clear. I think folks have made this point already that it's up to the South Korean leadership to shape the discussion and bring its public along, to the right understanding of what is being done and what needs to be done. I don't think we can do that for them, and we'll have to see if they're able to do that.
Yeah, it's
So,
interesting. Just a second, Jenny. It's interesting when General Scaparrotti mentions South Koreans think deterrence can stop North Korea from conducting tests. That's been a continuing theme from South Koreans, as far as I can tell, for the past 15 years. And yet that misconception is still out there. So there clearly, even among experts, there clearly needs to be something done beyond the alliance structures to educate people. Jenny, please.
yeah, I think we need to be a little bit careful of when we talk about the South Korean public and the political pressures about nuclear weapons, to distinguish between the public versus the policy community. Because what we see from the public and from public polling is that there isn't the same kind of assurance gap that we hear from the policy. If you look at public polling, there's generally in the 80 to 90% confidence in the alliance, 80 to 90% confidence in USFK, and high confidence that if something were to happen, that the US would be there and would respond. But you also see about 70% approval for South Korea to have nuclear weapons also. It isn't they want nuclear weapons because there's an assurance gap. They want nuclear weapons too. And I think that's really an important thing to remember, because we're so focused on deterrence and increasing deterrence as a way to try and solve a growing desire in South Korea for them to have their own nuclear weapons. But that's only part of the story. And what you hear more and more is that that there is an underlying desire of all this is really to have nuclear parity more so than it is just the aggression and the ability to respond with nuclear weapons. Is the idea of North Korea has nuclear weapons, South Korea should have nuclear weapons too. And at some point, I think when this debate first started inside South Korea, in the US, we didn't really take it seriously. It was very much a fringe view. And now that it's gained mainstream attention, the problem is over the past 10 years, this debate has gone on with a lot of talk about trying to make the case of why South Korea should have nuclear weapons without a lot of talk about what it would actually cost South Korea in terms of their reputation, in terms of their economy, in terms of all of the, sanctions and their own nuclear energy industry. None of this has been part of the debate over the past 10 years. And so only now are we starting to hear it because we're starting to take this more seriously. And I think, the more we have those kinds of discussions of what those trade-offs are, I think you might start to see some of the approval for nuclear weapons to come down.
Right, right. And that would be part of the public education, whatever it is, program, discussion. I mean, there have always been clear downsides. So I think you're absolutely right. People need to understand those downsides. Just to shift gears a little bit, earlier General Scaparrotti mentioned that there are ways of deterring, low-level deterrence through using conventional threats. And, one of the questions I've gotten is, when does deterrence cross over into provocation? And are the U.S. views on this the same as South Korea? And I think that's a very important point. Would anyone like to try to take that on?
I'll take it on, Joel, and I'd be interested in Elaine's comments as well from a perspective of the secretary. My personal opinion is that we're too cautious with respect to this term provocation. Often we wanted to deploy forces as a symbol of force in order to deter a conventional action of some kind in Korea. And it wasn't, it wasn't favorably considered in Washington. We just, as Americans, we tend to be more cautious in the use of our force, and there's goodness in that. But I believe that it can be used a little more forcefully than we do today, and kind of the big stick piece. And over time, they'll understand that there is a cost for their actions. Without that understanding of cost, as long as they feel we're unwilling or hesitant to act, they'll continue to do these provocations, etc. My opinion, personally, is the ROCs were usually quicker or more prone to respond than perhaps the Americans were within the alliance. So it was usually a discussion if there was a provocation of some kind as to how we responded. And I'll leave it at that and just see. I'd be interested in Elaine's comments.
Well, my observation is that whether it's a deterrent action and message or whether it's a provocation depends on the point of view. Certainly, North Korea sees our military exercises as provocative. We see them as deterrents. It's a matter of trying to deter aggression by them, and to be ready and trained to do that. So certainly, there's the perspective point of view. I have no idea whether North Korea thinks that when it does things that we think are provocative, they think they're deterring. I do know that I would pick up on what General Scaparrotti said about, at some points, I think there was a difference in perspective between ROC and the U.S. about what was the right response to provocations that came, North Korean provocations that came up, how hard you should push, what you should say, because certainly, yeah, there's a concern, there's a balance between you're concerned about conventional crisis or conflict escalating when you're talking about a nuclear armed adversary. You're concerned, yeah, rightly, you're concerned about that. On the other hand, you don't want them to think that because they've got nuclear weapons, they can do anything they damn well please. That's not the case either. So it's there's a balancing act that's a judgment call in each situation. I don't disagree with General Scaparrotti that there probably are times that the U.S. Is a little too cautious. But again, it's such a hard judgment call when it's a nuclear armed adversary that you don't know exactly how they're going to respond. We have had times when I think South Korea, when they rolled out the Korea Mass Punishment Retaliation Plan, for instance, which was, I would say, not well coordinated with us, that there was the concerns increased about how they might react versus what reaction we thought might be the right one in a given situation. But again, very context specific. No,
Joel.
there's no school book answer on this.
Right. If I could just add a quick point there. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think your question, Joe, is a reasonable one. Looking at different contexts. I mean, we're having a variant of this conversation with respect to Russia and Ukraine. In the Korea context, I mean, it just seems to me as an observer that, it doesn't take much on our part or the South Koreans' part to provoke the North Koreans. I mean, I agree that, we may want to think about a better balance and more robust kinds of responses to lower level provocations. But, it also may be the case that there are some kinds of actions by North Korea that are going to be just difficult to deter. So I would just make that point.
Can I
could I-
add one more?
I would add to the conversation that, General Brooks formulated with the South Koreans a pretty aggressive plan to respond to low-level provocations, their testing. And he put that in motion in the fall of 2017, including a fairly large air demonstration off North Korea's northeast coast after a nuclear test. So the plans are out there to do that. And, I'm sure the North Koreans weren't happy, but there wasn't a strong response to it either.
Joel, can I
Well,
make
if
one
I-
point?
Yeah,
There's something
General
that-
Scaparrotti, please.
Something when it comes to these conversations is obviously not pointed out, and it has to do with our exercises and where we hold them. And what we fail to mention every time is the Koreans are doing large exercises every summer throughout the summer. They've never slowed down. Those things go on, and yet we allow them to hinder our training that needs to be done because we believe, as they say, it's a provocation. That's my point. We need to understand how they operate and that they're continuing. I don't think they really see these exercises as a provocation at all.
Jenny, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think one of the problems we run into now is while some of the things that we're doing, we've done in the past in our regular and, we have our exercises. One thing that's missing from the equation right now, though, is any channels of communication. And in the past, we've always had at least back channels going with the North Koreans, either in inter-Korean or US DPRK, or even US China. And so there was much more communication while things were happening to help try and control the perception and help try and anticipate responses. And that is something now that's missing while tensions are high and while we're escalating the kinds of exercises that we're doing. We're continuing to do large scale live fire exercises and the North Koreans are responding. And so we're kind of caught in this spiral now without the off ramps that we normally would have at least be able to tap into.
Moving on to a different question. I think the issue of missile defense came up a little earlier, and I have a question for the audience, which is I would like to hear more discussion about the absence of missile defense in the Washington Declaration. Why was it omitted? What does that signal? I don't know, Paul, do you want to deal with that?
Um, sure. I mean, I can't answer those questions. I don't know why it was not discussed, and I don't know that it signals anything. I just can't answer that question. You'd have to ask a policymaker that question, I think. I think part of the reason may be that there's a concern that talking too much about missile defense might provoke, if I could put that word out there, since you just talked about it. Might be something that China reacts poorly to. And maybe that we wanted to just simply, we didn't have anything particularly new to say about missile defense. In terms of what we're doing with our cooperative programs with South Korea. Whereas, the rest of the Washington Declaration and really the rest of the entire summit package really, captures a wide range of sort of interesting agreements and initiatives. And maybe we just didn't have something on missile defense to sort of put on the table at this point. But I do think the dialogue with South Korea on missile defense continues. I think both sides consider it to be an important part of the equation. Beyond that, I don't have a lot of insight into why it wasn't specifically talked about here, including for the reasons that I mentioned, which is that our ability to sort of defend ourselves against the threat that concerns us the most in terms of the long-range North Korean ICBMs, is really an important part of the assurance equation. And so one would think that maybe it would get a mention, but not clear what the reasons why not.
And I guess after the declaration was issued, there was a story about how Japan and South Korea are stepping up cooperation on missile defense as well.
Right.
Anyone else want to address that, or we can just move on? I'm looking at all the other questions that have come in. Yeah, I would like to see more questions. I've only gotten like 2 or 3 questions from out in the audience. I think Jenny makes a really good point about the nuclear consultative group that may or may not be formed. I mean, the details really aren't out there. And I don't know, does anyone have any idea when these details might be forthcoming?
Well, I think the goal is to.
I don't know when they will be forthcoming. Paul, if you do, go ahead.
No, I don't. I couldn't give you a time frame. Except if I were sitting in the White House or OSD, I would say, let's move fairly quickly on this to set terms of reference for this group in terms of how it's going to be organized, at what level, with what kind of work program, and with what kind of sort of metrics of success, if I could use that term. I think in a different scenario or situation, we would have taken the time to maybe work some of those details out so that they could be sort of released as part of the declaration itself. But I think the calendar was working against that, given the state visit and sort of a sense of urgency that we needed to sort of at least announce this thing, even if the details are TBD. And I would agree with what everyone else has said, that the details are important. The details are important. And, I think the South Koreans in particular will be looking to see that, this is substantive and a little bit different from things we've done in the past, and sort of operationalizes the kinds of pledges that are made in admittedly generic language in the declaration itself. So, but if I had to guess, I'd say, within a few months, we will try to have worked out the terms of reference for this thing. I don't know when it will meet for the first time. I think when it meets for the first time, will probably have to be something that is sort of driven by what's already on the calendar in terms of some of these other consultative mechanisms that are in place and that are already on the calendar, I think, for the rest of the calendar year, and maybe even into the next calendar year as well. So there's a lot of logistics to work out in addition to the substance.
Lane, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, it will. I look forward to seeing how it is, how the details are spelled out. It will need to be, it seems to me, high enough so that it assures the South Korean side that we are taking all this very seriously. I would observe that the extended deterrence Strategy and Consultative Group last met at the undersecretary level of both defense and state. And I don't know that it's going to replace ministerial meetings. So in NATO, there is a high-level group that supports the nuclear planning group. It is called the high-level group. And it seems to be that this is almost like that if it were at the, say, assistant secretary level. So you need it high enough so that it's clear that it's very serious, but you also need to have real experts. I'm sorry, undersecretaries have a wide portfolio. And so very few are very expert in nuclear issues, for instance. You might get someone who came out of that background, and so they are, but you don't always have that. And so you really do need experts supporting this if it's to be very concrete and have real legs. You need experts supporting it. So exactly what the highest level, and then who supports that and makes the meetings and helps them understand what the options are and what they need to be talking about. You need real experts for that. The DSC, for instance, had both nuclear experts, strategic command, my organization, various people who really knew nuclear very deeply, as well as alliance managers. The Deputy Assistant Secretary for Northeast Asia was also part of that. And so you need this combination of expertise to come together. And then where does USFK play? How do they play into this? They need to. We always had them there. And how do they play into it? How does CFC come into this as well? So all those are really important details to be worked out.
If I could just pile, Joe, I'm just going to pile on for just a second.
I want to inject a comment here. Before we get too much into the expert talk, to me, once again, going back to the public angle, I mean, all this is great, but to me, I think what you need is a big building with a lot of people in it, and you call it your nuclear consultative group, and you put it in the middle of Seoul. I mean, of course, that's a slight exaggeration, but once again, I understand everything that's going on and it's all impressive, but it has to be made readily understandable to a bigger group of people. I'm sorry, Paul, go ahead.
No, I would agree with that. I just want to go back to what Elaine said, that yeah, she's right. I mean, this does require real expertise. If you use the high-level group as a rough model for this, that's a group that gets its work done because the people know what they're doing and what they're talking about. Of course, I think that may raise a sort of a practical question in the U.S. about the bandwidth that is needed to sort of support this particular new initiative in combination with all the other things we're doing with the South Koreans, and plus, whatever aspirations we may have to include others in this downstream. And for the South Koreans, it does raise this education question. This is something General Scaparrotti referred to, which I think is very important. I think it's a good bet that when this, Washington Declaration is rolled out in more detail, terms of reference, whatever you want to call it, it will have an education component, which is designed to, help educate at the working level South Korean civilians and military officers, to get them to the point where they can be useful contributors to this kind of process. So I think that's important. And in my view, there also should be a parallel effort dealing with more senior types to make sure that, we can create, sort of what I would call maybe a level playing field of expertise. So these kinds of groups can actually get some work done. So I think the education piece is an important part of the equation, even though I think it's discussed in the White House fact sheet that there's going to be some kind of education initiative. And, I know that work's being done on that right now to try to make that concrete.
Anyone else want to add to this before we move on?
I would just say that, building on what Paul said, there has to be education both inside and outside governments. I mean, you've talked about publics a lot, But given the constant turnover in both on both the ROC and U.S. sides, both with elections, with just partly routine civilian and military turnover, there have been people on both sides who understood this within governments, understood this very well and had real conversations, not reading talking points to each other, but real conversations about it. But those people turn over. And so you almost have to redo the internal education and then the external for publics.
Joel, can I say, I think that is sort of making the case for why having a building and having permanent staff is something we should be considering for the future, to be able, if we're going to talk about institutionalizing this as part of the alliance relations and institutionalizing greater dialogue on extended deterrence, we do need that expertise, both inside and outside of government, but without the rotation, but to get actual experts, to get, and not lose that every couple of years through the rotational system.
There's another question from the audience, which I think is very relevant. It's, can the future of extended deterrence develop to deter North Korea's escalatory behavior in cyber and space activities? I'm not sure what the answer to that is. I'm sure, General Scaparrotti, that's something you may have had to think about before.
Yeah, I mean, more and more, each of those domains have intersection. It's difficult to say today, for me to say, how much you can deter in cyber. We probably do, I think, based on what I know, but it's cyber is a realm that's changing every day, and deterrence can be very short-lived because of new ways of attack, new forms of use of the systems. So I think there's definitely overlap. It's a hard question, though, to answer. How can they evolve to be a form of that? I mean, clearly, cyber offers some. It offers some capabilities that can send a signal, notify your intent without it being actually public, but well known by your adversary. And what you find is with people like Putin or Kim Jong-un is if you can send a stern signal without it being public, i.e. embarrassing them, it probably is a fairly effective deterrence step. And cyber can give you some of those capabilities.
The issue of space activities is very interesting. It's not there yet, but it's clear North Korea is going to have many more space activities in the future. And I'm curious, Elaine, do you have any thoughts about that, or cyber?
Well, this is we're facing this not just with North Korea, but all potential adversaries, where there are more tools for aggression or contributing to some kind of aggressive act. There are more tools that we can use to deter. I mean, this is the whole idea behind the term integrated deterrence, which is the latest term, but we've been talking about it, cross domain and other ways. We've been talking about this for a number of years, decades. But exactly what the right combination of tools on our collective side to deter exactly which combination of tools and actions on the other guys on the adversary side, that's the part that's difficult, and it depends a lot on context, what they're trying to do, what we have, what we can do. I agree with everything that Scap said about cyber. It's a hard domain to know exactly. Again, work in progress about how we conceptualize and concretely apply tools to adversaries' tools to deter them, their use.
Yeah, I would,
Joel,
Joel.
Go on,
Sorry.
Paul.
No, go ahead.
I would just say, look, I think that the full range of challenges that we face in space and cyber, are not are not going to be things that are fully addressable by a traditional approach to deterrence. I mean, we need to think about, a broader toolkit that also sharpens our denial capabilities and works toward space and cyber architectures that are, much more redundant and much more sort of deeply resilient. And if you look at the NDS, National Defense Strategy, that's what it emphasizes for those architectures and those domains. Um, and I think the other question is when you look at the specific strategies for cyber and space, you see that same emphasis on the need for deeper resilience, and the hope being that deeper resilience will over time have a deterrence effect, but it's not necessarily reliant on traditional forms of deterrence by cost imposition and things like that. Now, the degree to which we can do this in collaboration with allies like South Korea, I think, is to be determined. I think there is, some prospect for doing these things collaboratively and, under the rubric of something you might call extended deterrence. But if some of these things we'll be doing on our own, so there's probably some balance that we can achieve in things we do sort of unilaterally on a national basis and things we may be able to do in collaboration with our allies. So it's I would just generally agree with what the General and Elaine said. It is very complicated, and we are just beginning to work our way through it.
Scap, did you want to add something? Whoops. We can't hear you, Scap.
I was good and turned my mic off.
There.
The character of war is changing, and we're really at the point now where we're figuring out what all of these different technologies, we're trying to master them, and we're trying to see how they come together in a nexus, and that's the key. And we're not there yet. But there's some incredible things going on in some of the combatant commands that I think give me cause for, to be positive about the future. But as Paul said, we're not there yet. But we can see that there's great opportunity in how we combine these domains.
Agreed.
Sort of scrolling down the remaining questions. There's a question about, do you believe the US and ROK should collaboratively fashion a common set of messages regarding extended deterrence for use bilaterally with China, Russia, and North Korea? That may be a little too ambitious, but the idea of a common set of messages, you think that is a good idea?
I think coordinating our messages is a good idea. They don't have to be exactly the same words. Our emphasis may be different, but having, going generally in the same direction and coordinating those, knowing if they're going to be different, I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, look, this is one of the issues coming out of the Washington Declaration, and maybe Jenny, you can comment on this because you've been in Korea recently. But some concern that the messages coming out of both sides after the declaration were not fully consistent and not fully synchronized. And we can understand why each side may have a particular spin it wants to make on the outcome. If those messages begin to diverge too significantly, we're creating a new kind of problem, I think. So yeah, I would agree. Coordination on messages is pretty important.
Well, I think this was really a problem with the Washington Declaration. And again, one of the reasons why I think it was somewhat premature to announce the nuclear consultative group without any of the details, because in South Korea, there was very few people who understood what they got out of this and what this was going to mean, what was going to look like, and especially then how to convey that to the public in a way that looked like it was a good deal. And so what you heard a lot was, the South Korean way of conveying this was, well, this is now a nuclear alliance. We're now sharing nuclear weapons. And so they kept using this term of nuclear sharing as a way to explain to the public how this is different from things in the past. Which of course was technically incorrect, and which was then, corrected by the U.S. government afterwards, which then, really again diminished the what actually happened with this fight back and forth about what actually happened. One of the comments I heard last week was that when the South Koreans tried to sell this to the public as a nuclear sharing agreement to show that it was a great leap forward, when the U.S. Contradicted that, the South Koreans were like, well, why didn't they just go along with it? You know, this was their way of understanding what was happening, even though it was technically incorrect and had very different implications. And so I think if we don't coordinate messages, if there weren't common talking points that came out that they could build off of to talk about the value of what was being done, we end up with those kinds of messages that are very counterproductive and really stumbling over each other.
Anyone else want to comment on this issue? I am out of questions from the audience. So, Scap, did you want to say something?
I noted that one of the questions had to do with the United Nations Command and their role in dialogue. The U.S. commander is the Combined Forces Command commander, the U.S. Forces commander, and he's also the UN commander. And the UN commander's role is to assure that the armistice is withheld and that there's peace in the DMZ. All right, that's his job. And there is dialogue there. There's a hotline. There's the ability to meet, stand on each other on either side of the 38th parallel and talk to each other. There's neutral nations that help us observe what's going on in the DMZ. Unfortunately, the North Koreans moved theirs out. They're only on the south now. But there is a responsibility for that UN commander to do that. When there are violations of the armistice, a report is made and it's delivered to each of the countries, including North Korea. They get it. Not sure whether they read it, but they get it. And so there is an opportunity there. I think it's important because the United Nations Command does play a key role and does influence this when there are provocations. They do have some authority there. They do have some influence. And the other nations, the 16 or 18 nations a part of the UN command there, also have influence with respect to their national influence. So I found it as a very important role. I just wanted to point that out if I could take a minute to do so.
Thanks, Cap. Well, I think we've pretty much gone over a lot of this subject, a lot of interesting points, a lot of pros, a lot of cons, but I'm sure this is going to be a subject for discussion in the future. So I want to thank everyone for participating and have a good rest of your